So we're going to start this video off with a similar caveat that we did with my drum tutorial at the start of this year. Something self-deprecating about a deeply unqualified tutorial kind of thing. In that video, I felt like I had to give that kind of caveat because I am not at all a drummer, barely a producer, and barely a keyboard player. But my thinking was, if I can make drums sound good, if I can write parts and mix them and have them sound great in one of my songs, anybody can. That is a firm belief I have. Like, if I can do that, then you can do that. And we're here today to talk about how I mix stereo guitars because much like that video, I feel like everything I have learned and developed about how I approach mixing stereo guitars in one of my tracks is based entirely in kind of my own stumbling through the kind of like fog of war that is learning how to mix without any real guidance from somebody else. And if I can learn how to do this and I can find techniques that work for me, then they might work for you as well. And like I said, the important caveat here is I have never read any books on engineering or mixing. I have taken no courses. I have never been the kind of like understudy to some dark wizard of the arcane arts of rock album creation. This is all me and I'm not kidding here, me in my laundry room in my house right now, mixing these songs, writing, recording, mixing, mastering, producing, and everything. And it's been all either done in here or formerly in my kitchen. So if I can find tips and tricks and workflows that work for me, I am sure that they will either, one, get you on the right path towards a more correct version of things, if such a thing can exist, or two, at least show you that like the trial and error process can lead you somewhere really useful. And to that end, I want to give you my 3 tips for mixing stereo guitars. And the nice thing about these tips is they're all very fuzzy. They're all very imprecise. There are and are not gear recommendations mixed in across the 3 of them, but none of them are hard, fast rules or this is the 2A you need, or even this is the style of compressor you need. It is just some thoughts on panning, compression, and EQ. But before we get into it, this video is brought to you by DistroKid. As you've heard me talk about before, I have been using DistroKid since day one of my publishing music. My first band's EP was uploaded through DistroKid, is still out there today because we used DistroKid. I knew even 10 years ago that if I was going to release music, this was the obvious cost-benefit analysis. DistroKid just seemed like the obvious right choice. And here we are some 10 years later, and I still feel that way because they're as good a value as they were then, if not better, because they've added so much to their services over the last decade. One of the most recent and major updates is they have an app now. I have DistroKid on my phone, which is really, really cool. You've got access to all your financials, all your stats. You can even upload music through their iOS app. DistroKid's always adding something new. So to get 7% off your DistroKid membership to help support this channel, you can use my link in the description down below. Thank you to DistroKid for sponsoring this video. So tip number 1, let's talk about panning your guitars. I think this is tip number 1, both because it's the first thing you would do, and I think it's going to be the most obvious big shift in your workflow depending on what you've been doing before this. Conventional wisdom is you put a 57 in front of an amplifier, you record it in mono, and then if you're doing 2 guitars, you pan them left and right, typically hard left and hard right. I've never been a big fan of that approach, even with mono guitars. I'm not sure what it is about me that kind of doesn't like that, but I've always tended towards soft panning in those environments versus hard panning. But it's also worth knowing I've almost never recorded mono guitars, like strictly mono guitars. Even when I'm recording a real amplifier with something like the UA aux, I'm still typically using the left and right sends out of that aux to make use of its built-in plate reverb. And the reason for that is I am a kind of like massive stickler for stereo reverb. I don't like the sound of mono reverb in a final product because I think that mono reverb sounds unnatural. Reverb is supposed to be the sound of the space that you are in, or the sound of an imagined space. And when you're in a space, your 2 ears are picking up different reflections on both sides. And to lose that is to lose the feeling of listening to a band play in front of you, listening to guitars that kind of envelop the space that you're in. And so because of that, I don't like to collapse my guitars down to hard left and hard right, even in mono, but especially in stereo. That hard panning process can actually do a lot to thin your guitars out, to kind of, sure, create added space in the center of your mix if you need to add something else there, but you lose the nuance of your stereo effects. So for these demonstrations, we are going to be revisiting the intro track that I did for the Origin DCX Boost. There's a bunch of great stereo guitars on that track that, because it was focused on dry tone, have lower wet mixes and more of a center dry guitar focus, but they still make great use of the Strymon El Capistan in stereo and the New Neighbor Illumin in stereo. So let's go into our DAW. Let's listen to how I had them panned for the final product, as well as then kind of like resetting them to both being kind of center channel mono, as well as some hard panning options to hear how that will kind of transform the character of your overall mix as you move your balances left and right. So I've compressed down the mix generally here. The drums, brass, and bass are all on kind of buses over here for clarity's sake and for kind of simplicity's sake. We've stripped all the plugins and all of the panning stuff out of the guitars along the way. And let's give kind of like this verse section that we're going to be listening to right up here. Let's give this a listen with no processing and no panning on the kind of like central guitars. And so as you can hear, if we solo up that palm verse part, which is going to be that palm muted dotted eighth thing, you can hear that El Cap delay tends to prioritize the right side on the repeats because of the Haas effect, and you can hear a little bit of that stereo ambiance from our reverb as well. And now, in kind of traditional mono guitar panning, especially for like a rock mix, what you would tend to do with two guitars like this would be to hard pan them like this. But I tend to not like the way that you lose your kind of like stereo ambiance in those situations. Again, if we bring this this kind of central dotted eighth delay part back, I don't like the loss of dimensionality there. In the same way that like if you kind of set both of these to center value zeros and made it like truly mono guitar, versus that space. And a lot of people would even maybe go as far as to kind of like pan over a certain amount, where you still have a little bit of that width left. I actually tend to like to leave it crossing over that center threshold a little bit for both guitars. If you need more space in that center channel, obviously it makes sense to then kind of like go past that, either to that center point or slightly past it, where you're still holding on to some of that stereo width. And that's especially useful because for that verse part, we have this chime guitar that comes in that is like centered in the mix. Obviously not like mono-centered, but like sits kind of like center channel to the extent that stereo guitars do. Now for the original mix, we actually have our guitars panned something like this. So let's look at why you might want to pan further out for that kind of thing. Let's just grab the section of this verse where those chimes come back in. In that circumstance, you may actually want to pan those guitars farther out. Fun kind of final note. We talked about that that Haas effect that the El Capistan has on its delay repeats, where it feels more to the right channel. And the consequence of that is if you solo this up, you will still hear your delay repeat hitting closer to center channel under this circumstance, because you hear it mostly on the right side here. So what you can actually do is flip the two of these, take this all the way hard, and then bring that closer to center. And now you're getting a more pronounced left channel delay repeat. Like I said, there are no hard, fast rules here. This is all, in my opinion, panning to a combination of to taste and to what you still have to make room for. If the guitars are going to be the center point of your composition and you're only running two, I think letting them crosstalk in that center channel is really valuable. If you need something to kind of stand aside to make room for something that is supposed to be properly center channel, whether it's a third guitar, a vocal, or some other lead melodic instrument, that's a great opportunity to take those pans a little bit farther than you otherwise would. Tip number 2 concerns compression. If you know me at all, you know that I love my compressors, both in and out of my pedal board. I almost always have a compressor first in chain on my pedal board, whether it's the Bondi 2026 or the Origin 1176. But I also use a ton of compression in my DAW in my mixing process. And when I say a ton of compression, I don't mean heavy compression. I mean multi-stage subtle compressors that cascade into one another or run in parallel with one another to get even active sounding, responsive final mixes, things where your guitars sit exactly where you want them to in the mix and don't fight each other in a stereo field. So as we go back into our DAW, we'll take a look at how I use 2 additional stages of compression after my DAW to get both kind of even guitars on the left and right sides, as well as even response as those two hit a follow-up bus compressor. We're using Universal Audio's LA2A compressors on the individual guitar channels, and then they will go into a shared guitar bus using the API 2500 bus compressor. So having our panning dialed for the purposes of this piece, let's talk about how we stack compression. We're going to actually reset the panning on this first guitar right here so that we can kind of give a listen to a subtle amount of what I would like to call stage 1 compression, although in this circumstance it's mostly stage 2 or stage 3, depending on how much compression you are using on the pedal board you recorded into. For me, I'm probably using a compressor on that guitar part already. For me, I tend to like a LA2A compressor for almost all purposes, except if I'm using a compressor to kind of beef up a lead part a little bit more. I like an 1176. But for a part like this that I think already sounds nice and full and robust, I'm a big fan of the 2A compressor. I tend to like having my gain pretty much where it kind of factory sets over here, because I tend to try to like make sure that I'm recording into my DAW right around -12, so I'm already hitting kind of a good initial amount of gain staging. Maybe beef it just a hair, and then bring up my reduction until I'm getting a nice hit. And the rationale for this is if you can make sure that you have both of your kind of like primary guitar parts kind of complementing each other on levels. You can get a little bit of added extra width by compressing them using the same style of compressor, but separately from one another. And the nice thing about that is it gives you a nice even stereo spread as you go into your actual guitar bus over here, which you can then do what I like to call kind of like second, or I guess in this case, third stage compression before we hit our, actual final compression, which is going to be in the mix bus. So no compression. And now that right channel is not peaking up above the left channel when it hits harder. And then what I really like to do is grab an API bus compressor. I really like the Universal Audio one. I used the Waves one for years before UA's Spark came out, and I was able to start using this without having to like buy it outright. I love this. I literally just use the electric guitar fat preset on here, and then I just kind of like make minor adjustments to taste, including gain makeup over here and setting my actual threshold. But you'll find that like at the outset, it sounds pretty immediately great. Which is great, and it fattens things up. It adds a little bit more kind of like I think it plays off of the stereo width that you're getting from those kind of like dual mono compressors over here, or I guess dual stereo compressors under the circumstances. And it also adds added a little bit of marriage for this chiming guitar part. So like if we bring both of these down just a hair so that the chimes can sit out ahead of the mix a little bit and turn off that compressor. Again, it adds a little bit of glue to everything and lets everything sit together a little bit more confidently. And my last tip is EQ. In a perfect world, your guitar sounds as close to done as possible when you record it. Whether it's putting a 57 in front of a cabinet or plugging into an amp sim, you want your guitars to be as close to done as possible before you hit your DAW. But there are almost no circumstances where additional editing is not required. Whether it's additional compression or EQing, your guitar parts always need a little bit of extra love and editing in the DAW. The process of mixing is the process of asking more of your parts than you originally intended. Things that need to hit harder than you thought they were going to. Things that actually are a little bit overbearing and need to dial back a little bit, but just turning the fader down is not the right answer. When you're mixing stereo guitars that sit on the left and right sides of a mix, they need to balance each other out. If one of them has a little bit too much bite but sounded great in a vacuum, you need to account for that. You need to repair that. Sometimes stereo guitars on top of each other, especially when there's some crosstalk in the center channel, you can get frequency buildups that are not super pleasant. So we're going to take a look at a couple of EQ options, both the 1073 from Universal Audio and Neve, or one of my absolute favorite tools that I use on almost every single track these days, OEK Sounds Soothe 2. I don't know if that's the actual name of the company. I think I'm pronouncing that right. But Soothe 2 is an incredible reactive EQ. I don't actually know what it does beyond just kind of like EQ that kind of responds to your input signal. But Soothe 2 is a plugin that I found through Andrew Huang's channel a while back when he recommended it, and it was an instant buy for me. Whether it's high gain guitars or a digital amp sim, Soothe 2 has been a plugin that I have found is integral to kind of breathing real organic life back into guitar tracks. It helps dial back fizz without killing treble. It can de-mud the low end without making your guitars sound shrill and thin. It is just kind of an incredible utility tool. I've been recommending it on my Discord for my Patreon supporters for a while now, and everybody who has listened to me and downloaded it seems to have loved it too. So I feel very good about this recommendation. And there's an added little kind of trick that I love with Soothe 2 that we will get into in this demonstration in a second here, and it's that aside from just how effective it is as a reactive and kind of organic sounding EQ, you can also set it up to do mid-side processing, which adds another level of kind of stereo width and complexity to your stereo image of your guitars on a guitar bus, if that's where you use Soothe 2. So let's go back to our DAW. Let's take a look at our kind of various EQs that we're using and why I think Soothe 2 is so incredibly useful. I tend to think of EQ in this context as somewhat prescriptive. I lean towards a few specific static EQs like the SSL channel, the 1073, and the Hitsville equalizer. And then there's also kind of, like I said, the reactive EQ, something like Soothe. And let's start by looking at Soothe and how immediately, almost comically useful it can be. So let's pull up these guitar parts again, and let's just add Soothe in front of this API 2500 and see what happens even with Soothe completely factory stock. Do a little bit to clean up some harshness, some added fizz from digital guitar amps, all that stuff. Something like this center channel chimey thing. I mean, even just scrolling through the presets in here, there are some really great curious about what's being done here, you can always grab these and give a listen to what's being reduced. well. I'm also a big fan of, like I said, things like the 1070, the 1073, a very classic. Let's pull that palm verse back down and say we want a little bit more bite out of this. You can do things like carve your lows out, kind of do some gain adjustments. Pro tip, I like to kind of min-max out the gain on one of these things so that I can kind of find really obvious treble frequencies and work on them from there. But yeah, if I just want this guitar part to pop in the mix a little bit better. So same with this one's got a little bit more warmth to it, and say I want that to cut more because it's off to the right side, and that left one is now similarly. Another EQ I really like would be something like the Hitsville, where you can't adjust what frequency bands you are specifically attenuating or boosting or anything like that, but you do have just a really great set of frequency options available to you here. And I like that high is so high that I can actually pull back a little bit of a little bit of that buzz we're getting and still get teeth from my high mids and my treble. So yeah, if we go back and remove all of that stuff, let's listen to kind of like where we started and where we are now, because it shouldn't be too dramatic, but you do want to do little things along the way to really get you to where you need to be. So take everything out. And with that, I am both out of tips and nearly out of bourbon. So I think we're going to call it here. I hope that some of this stuff was useful. As always, if you have any recommendations for things that you want me to touch on, if there's something from my songs, my demo process, anything that you see on this channel that you would like to know more about. If you don't want to wait for the next video, join my Patreon, join the Discord and ask questions there. I'm always on there. I'm happy to kind of dig into any of this stuff any more than I already have. So thanks for watching, and until next time.